The reserves, of course, are always speculative. But one thing is, and the reserves, by the way, is one thing we're not going to talk about tonight. I mean, we're really talking about the geographical impact, the spatial extent of it, not the volumetric extent of it, or the volumetric potential. We're not talking about reserves. But one thing you can be sure of, irrespective of the reserve estimates, is that spatial extent always starts at the maximum and it shrinks, it consolidates. And it's just to give an illustration that obviously a vertical well is tapping a trap, which is usually fairly, even in Saudi Arabia, is fairly limited geographic area, whereas the shale, when it's initially explored, it could potentially be, at least from the lay term, be anywhere over a very large area. The hot shale before the Marcellus was the Haynesville, which happens to be in East Texas and central Louisiana, and its spatial extent was, well, I mean, that's where the shale was. And so initially people thought it was going to, well, some people, again, the laity, thought that it would be over that entire area. Very quickly, as soon as it started to be tested, it consolidated to basically the corner of 3 counties in central Louisiana. That play in particular is basically played out, at least economically currently. But that's indicative, and that just happened to be the hot deal before the Marcellus, and that's kind of what all of these shale plays, whatever, the Bakken, you name it. It's the nature of the beast. That's the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, southwest hotspot, northeast hotspot, and it's already started to consolidate. And frankly, that's where Jerry's model picks up on, is how you can map that and predict that consolidation. And of course, he's going to talk about how that consolidation impacts the earth stage. Then we've got the second constraint, other than the geology, is the economics. And we're going to drill down on that a little bit. But of course, it's the commodity price and it's the full cycle cost of producing the commodity. And then the net out of that, or the reduction of that, is the last thing we're talking about, which is the regulatory constraints to that geographic area. Something, that slide is wrong. There's more to it than that, I think, Mr. Podolka. I'll have to ad lib. That's kind of, well, it's funny, it's those first two. Because that's all you see, that's all you hear, really, is you've got this huge area, and then what you read about in the press, even today, whatever AP comes up with, is you hear about the ushers. And I mean, that's the nature of the media, it's dog bites man. But the problem is that the rest of the story, the rest of the slide, is that's not really what happens. What they are trying, well, the drilling, the operators are trying to do is they are trying to pump that up. They've got this area leased up, they extrapolate their winners, and then they flip it. And that's number 3. And then number 4 is they go back to step 1. And then, I'm not talking about some, penny stock. I mean, even the big companies, or the big companies that are pure play shale companies. And the way that happens is that basically what they do is they go and they test the well that might be, so say yellow is about average, green below average. These are tests over, say, a large area. That's above average, below average, average. And then guess what? And then they get lucky. And then guess what happens? So now that becomes the producing well. The rest of them are test wells. Well, he's going to talk about test wells in a minute. That's the one that they hook up to the pipeline. That's the one that they produce. That's the one that they report to the government. And then guess what happens to those leases? That's how the lease gets sold. And I'm talking about billions of dollars worth of leases. That's how they get sold. And of course, I told Sarah I wouldn't get political, but I mean, the shareholders hold the bag on that, whoever bought it. This was enabled from the sort of like the, what do they call it, the housing bubble subprime bubble because of something that happened in an accounting change that fascinates people like me and puts everybody else asleep. But basically, the SEC changed the rules on how you could book these unproved, undeveloped reserves. All that other acreage that wasn't producing, other than that hot spot. And what they did, that simple rules change, which happened in October 2008. Now, let me think, whose watch was that on? That tripled the reserves on paper within a matter of months. Now, the question is in fact this, is the Marcellus, is it economic at all? And the short answer is it, as uneconomic as some of it is, it happens to be one of the most economic shale plays in the United States. The Haynesville that's by the way, that horizontal line was at the time that the merchant bankers that pushed this out to Wall Street sent this thing out. That was the price, that was a commodity price of gas, $4.50 a thousand. And those bar charts is the fully loaded cost of developing that, of producing that. So anything above that line, which is, $4.75, call it, what is uneconomic. So the Haynesville that we talked about at the beginning was already uneconomic when this thing came out, a year and a half ago. In fact, a year and a half or so ago, the only three that were productive or were cost effective was the Eagle Ford and those two Marcellus, the southeast and this is gas, by the way, and southwest and northeast. Does that make any sense to you? This, by the way, is the producer break even. This is not necessarily the fully loaded, but this is the average well, not the financial accounting of it, but just the average well. And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, there's different break-even scenarios here. I get carpal tunnel on this one. Now, here's the thing. So we have this, this extrapolated production from that gusher, and I call it the PR because the press release on this well, the one that you all read about, is that it breaks even if gas is at $5, or you hear a hot well down in Bradford County, it'll break even at $1.50 or something. Well, might be true, in fact, for that one well, that, Gannett or A&P, or AP, showing my age. That's what they would advertise. But that isn't, in fact, that's not even what it is to the company. If you fully load the cost of that well, you put in, Lou's salary at Mobil and all the overhead and all the exploration costs, then the cost of that, from the financial accounting standpoint, would be more like 7. So they don't, you're not going to read a story in the New York Times that a well was in Pennsylvania, the fully loaded cost at the corporate level was $7. I wouldn't, Deborah Rogers would, but nobody else would. But there's more to it than that, because think about it. You've got all those dry holes that were drilled, not by this company, by all those companies that Flint leased and went out of business, or the head dry holes and went out of business. If you add those costs from a systemic, Jerry didn't want me to use that word, but I will, from a macro standpoint, and you throw in the remediation costs of cleaning up the mess of all those wildcat wells, then the cost of producing that gas goes up. And I'm not even talking about, Al Gore's carbon tax. I'm just talking about the overall cost of producing that gas. So, this is from the Energy Information Agency that's gospel to everybody because it's basically just a composite of numbers that the industry gives the government. And so that's a projection of sort of a high, medium, low scenario for gas pricing. And as you can see, again, sort of the sticker number for around here is like $5 an MCF for these Marcellus wells to be booked. So, okay, so it's $5. So, we're looking at 2025. And that's not the financial accounting cost. That's not the fully loaded cost. That's just what the PR people say it would be. So, okay, so it's 2025. But there's there's price inelasticity comes in. You can't deal with this in isolation. What happens is people think, well, yeah, but it was at 12 and it'll go to 30 someday for my grandkids. Well, I don't think so, And the reason why is because you've got coal down there crawling along out to 2040 at like $4, whatever it is, a million BTU, whatever they price it. And you have alternatives, you have renewables with the price coming down. So basically you have the cost of coal constraining the upward price of natural gas in this country, like it or not. And you've got renewables that's basically serving as a cap to the price escalation of that commodity. Something like that. And this is Lou's idea, and it's a jury draft. They let me present it because I was the tallest. Then you have the regulatory limits. And again, this is, I'm the biggest complainer about this, but you have this sort of this debate about regulation, but people don't think about what the net impact is. You've obviously got the proposed state regs, the S guys, the drilling, fracking reg, whatnot. You've got the valley districts, not the valley girls. And then you have local ordinances like, God bless them, drive. That people think they focus on kind of the big headlines, and of course that's New York City and Syracuse watershed. It just takes out a Boku drilling area. But then there's state forests and whatnot that are riparian districts and whatnot that reduce that area. And then you have even the proposed state regs, which I will not make an editorial comment on because I promised that. But if you net those out, then what you find is, and of course you've got these river districts, is that, and a very good study was done on this, is you take those and you map them out, and just really in theory, not really carrying map stuff. But you map them out, then it shows what the net reduction of drillable area would be. Just the proposed regulation. Now what's interesting is if you get into an area that has a high population density, and for illustrated purposes, you normalize that over the entire area, you find that given the setbacks from housing, you can't drill any wells there. I mean, that's sort of, you didn't need me to tell you that. But I mean, you can in theory begin to get a sense of what that impact is. The other one is, and it's kind of a funny one, is that, if you drill one of these horizontal wells and you hit a vertical well, then you've recreated the Trevi fountain. And so the DEC is not unmindful of that fact. And so there's a 1 mile mapping setback from any existing vertical wells, meaning you've got to show that you're not going to hit that well with a horizontal. But the funny thing is that if you go to some counties that have been drilled up as much as East Texas, like Chautauqua County, that means you can't drill any horizontal wells because there's no place you can drill a well down there and run a lateral and not, recreate Old Faithful. And then of course there's the Delaware and these are examples. Delaware, 58% reduction drillable area. Chautauqua County, in theory, is almost 100% reduction in drillable area. Again, in theory. And then I picked the one that I happen to be familiar with, Otsego, because of population density. A huge reduction in drillable area. And this is with the regs as proposed. So you end up, again, this is in theory, you end up with an 83% reduction in drillable area in New York State versus a theoretical reduction of 35% in Pennsylvania, just based on existing regs. Now, the catch is that you can't normalize density so that, there's one, in a county or in a SMSA where there's like, one house neatly placed every 200 feet, unless you live in a suburb. And Karen did this one, because obviously under the existing regs, if there's a 500-foot setback from a house, then clearly you couldn't. I mean, it's just a matter of how you're clever about it. Oddly enough, in this map, those three houses would have to be somebody would have to be all, gung-ho about this, or one of those guys might have to have been compulsory integrated, and if in fact a well was drilled there. But that's another story. The point is this, is it, certainly at a local level, at a township level, you can map this, and from a comprehensive land planning standpoint, it would be a good exercise to do it. And then, of course, and this is, mind you, all this is before we talked about the bans, which are basically prohibitions of heavy industrial use. In red, yellow, the purple, which are moratoriums, are the same, and the yellow, which are ostensibly initiatives in that direction. Some of these, if these laws are well written, if they go to the quote ban stage, then they would also address road use, disposal of frack waste, waste treatment in municipal water plants, dumping, drill cutting into landfills, that sort of thing. These are tangential, obviously, limitations to drilling. They're not as direct as, say, the prohibition of drilling itself. So what is that? And what's the net effect? The effect is that you can kind of get a sense of this by looking at what the drilling apps are for horizontal wells in the state. But the EC keeps a file of it. And so that's clearly an indication that somebody wants to drill a well there if they pull an app permit. The apps, the curious thing about the apps is they only really reflect the geology. The company thinks there's something worth drilling there. They do not, they may partially reflect the economics because those may be old apps. They may be $12 MCF apps in an old lease. They may not really reflect the company's intention. They don't particularly want to remove the app from the queue. And then they really don't reflect the restrictions that we talked about. Because remember, the only thing it takes to get an app into that queue is that you just got to show up with 640 acres, a section of square mile. You don't have to, say that you're not going to kill any snail darters. And what's interesting to me is you look at those apps, which, wonks like me do, and you see that there's very few of them that would really be viable in this state. That happens to be an Exxon XTO, a well over in the Catskills. That also happens to be in the Delaware Valley, right upstream from the Josh. So the geology is Jerry's. What are y'all waiting for? Jerry's going to talk about how that's a geological possibility, that well location. The economics, I don't know, maybe not. Exxon's got the money to spud the well, but the restrictions, I think, might kill that app. I mean, if it came to that standpoint. And that's indicative, but think about it, where we started with a map of everything, from the border to the Adirondacks, from the Mohawk to the Hudson. And that's kind of it. That's Exxon's only remaining app in the queue in our state of New York. So, noodle on that. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Thank you.
Good evening. Before tonight's presentation digs into well data in the Marcellus, both in Pennsylvania by Jerry and in New York by Lou, I would like to bring us up to speed on how the geology in the Black Shale affects the productivity of gas wells. By now you've heard that to get gas out of the Black Shale, wells are drilled vertically down to the shale and then horizontally within it. Then the shale must be fractured in order to release the gas. But all black shales in the Marcellus are not equally endowed with gas. You can't just drill anywhere and expect to turn a profit. Here are the most important. important factors that affect how much gas is produced by a well after it's fracked. At the top are the most important factors: organic content, thermal maturity, thickness, and depth. Check. Thank you. The most important properties: organic content, thermal maturity, thickness, and depth. We'll take a look at each in turn. It is the organic matter in shales that breaks down to form the gas. No organics, no gas. Black shales like the Marcellus have more than 2% organic matter. These are rock samples cored from a well. Here you see the interbedded black shales and gray siltstones. The total organic content is the most commonly reported measure of organic matter. The New York State Geological Survey measured the TOC profiles across Marcellus layer in wells throughout the southern tier here, choosing one or more deep wells in each one of these counties. The results shown here are for the most organic rich sample across each one of those profiles. This is an update of the 2009 map, which is copied in the S-guides. Clearly there is enough organic matter in most of the central southern tier, particularly in these two areas. In contrast, the prospects do not look particularly good for the eastern southern tier in and around the Catskills. For the wider region, here is an estimated TOC based on the radioactivity of the rocks. In general, the more uranium there is in the rock, the more carbon. In New York, we see the same general trends with highs here and here. In Pennsylvania, where there's tactical production, in general we see pretty average levels of carbon. Petroleum is created by destruction, as longer molecules are broken down into shorter ones. Heat is required to break down organic matter into gas, heat that leaks up from the inside the earth. As the rocks are buried deeper and hotter, the plant matter is broken down to kerogen, which is something like tar. In the hotter oil window, the kerogen is broken down to oil. Then in turn, the oil is broken down into a mixture of natural gas, liquids, and methane, which is known as wet gas or immature gas. With even more heating, the natural gas breaks down into methane, and you're left with almost pure methane, which we call natural gas or mature gas. More heating still, and the natural gas begins to break down into carbon dioxide, what we call overmature gas. Note that the methane breakdown is very sharp here. In Pennsylvania, this is called the line of death. Each layer in the sedimentary sequence is heated hotter than the layer above it. So for thermal maturity, we must consider each layer individually. This is a temperature map for the Devonian layer, which includes the Marcellus. The hotter rocks here are marked in red, and the cooler rocks are marked in blue. I've added the approximate boundaries for the immature, mature, and overmature gases. In New York, most of the Marcellus is in the mature gas zone, with the less valuable dry gas. The most productive regions in the Pennsylvania, the sweet spot here is just above what Engelliger has called the line of death, because production drops off so sharply to the southeast. Now, there's not much data in this region to tell us where the line of death extends into New York. However, if we look at the next map, this is copied from the S-guides. Most of this Catskills over here are overcooked. Again, I've labeled the three regions: immature, mature, and overmature. Now, if the shale is rich enough in organics, and if the shale is heated within the gas window, the next thing you need for a productive well is enough shale to frack. Fracking is the fracturing of a cylinder of rock around the wellbore, horizontal wellbore. To produce the most gas, you want the cylinder to be as large as possible that can fit within the shallow layer. Now here is the geometry of that. The Marcellus here lies between two limestones. The volume of the cylinder is proportional to the square of the thickness. And therefore, as the layer gets thinner, it decreases sharply. It decreases very sharply at first. For example, if a layer is half as thick, then the volume that gets fractured is 1/4 of the volume. Half the thickness, 1/4 of the volume. As a result, production drops off very sharply away from the sweet spot, as you saw in Chip's maps of the Haynesville and the Marcellus play. Therefore, the thinner the shale, the less potential for gas production, going west, north, and east from the sweet spot. Most of the organic-rich regions in the Marcellus in New York are below 100 feet. And here in Ithaca, far from the sweet spot, the Marcellus is only about 75 feet thick. Now 75 feet is 1/4 of the thickness in the sweet spot, so that's 1/16 of a volume that's available to frack, or only about 6%. Depth and pressure also affect productivity. This Marcellus shale has natural spaces to store gas, both in the visible fractures and the microscopic pores. The greater the pressure and the depth, the more gas that can be squeezed into those spaces. Even if you have enough gas down in the shale, you still have to get it to the surface. Gas here in the Marcellus is overpressured, resulting in a flood of gas when at first, like when the carbon dioxide when you open the bottle of soda. After the initial release from the fracture, the gas must be pushed out of the rock. This graph shows how the pressure increases as you go down into the earth. This line here is the pressure in the rock, and this line here is the pressure in a well filled with water. It is the difference in pressure between these two that drives the gas into the well. This factor is so important that down in Pennsylvania, the operators will build the well on the hilltop rather than the valley to get a few hundred feet of extra pressure. Therefore, the shallower shale, the less potential for gas, going west, north, and east from the sweet spot. Here in Ithaca, far from the sweet spot, the Marcellus is just over 2,000 feet deep. As a rule of thumb, operators prefer to drill where the shale is over 4,000 feet deep, twice as much. To review, the four most important factors for gas production are organic content, thermal maturity, thickness, and depth. For the Marcellus in New York, there's enough carbon, but it looks like the Catskill is barren. For thermal maturity, dry gas, but again, the Catskill, it looks like it's overcooked. For the thickness and depth, they decrease going northward. So for the thickness, you're seeing lower frac volumes, and for the depth, you're seeing lower gas pressures. Just on these general considerations of geology, the prospects for profitable drilling of the gas production of the Marcellus do not look good for our southern tier. Most of the Marcellus is shallow and thin, and for the Catskills, it's overcooked and low in organics. These trends shouldn't come as a surprise, because this has been known since the start of the Marcellus play. Next up, Jerry will use actual production numbers from neighboring Pennsylvania to test whether the thickness and depth do indeed control gas production. And then he will project the possible production in New York should drilling begin. Thank you.
Everybody here? That better? He was on fine.
Check. Good evening, everybody. I got started in this kind of by chance. I was reading a lot of the press on gas drilling and hearing confusing stories about gas production and what were confusing to me. I heard a lot of stories about people making a lot of money, gushing wells, and I heard stories about people making no money and dry holes. And not knowing a whole lot about geology like I've learned working with these gentlemen, I wanted to explore that for myself and see if I could explain it. Because I couldn't find anything online or in talking to people to explain what that significant variation in information was. So I embarked on the process that I'm going to explain to you tonight and show you what I found. This is an animation map from MCOR, the Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, and it shows you the build-out of the wells in Pennsylvania that have occurred since 2007. And you can see, like has already been pointed out, there's a lot of activity in northeastern and southwestern. There's a number of different consolidation areas, like Chip mentioned. So if I'm going to understand what's going on south of the border, I had to pick an area of interest. I picked 6 counties in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, ranging across the border. And then I had read about the most productive area down there in the Tri-County area, just like in Haynesville, all consolidates down to this Tri-County area. But you can see there's a lot of wells there. Of course, there's a lot of wells over here as well, but I'm going to show you what they actually look like. And then what I discovered when I started looking at the geology is, for New York, the relevant geology is really more out in the western counties along the border, not down there where the sweet spot is. And I think Brian kind of showed you what's going on there a little bit. And then once I had done that primary area, as a systems engineer, I like to validate what I find and make sure it's not a fluke. So I went out into the western PA and I looked at 10 counties out there to see if there were any anomalies that might disprove what I found in the northern tier. I'll save the answer to that today. Having 31 years of experience doing systems engineering, I'm all about doing structured analysis, structured processes, having a good methodology, and sticking to it regardless of what the answers turn out to be. Not making it up as I go along. So I laid out this recipe that I'm going to show you here. First, I wanted credible data. And the PA DEP Oil and Gas Reporting website has an amazing amount of production data for all the wells in PA over that entire 5-year period. So I built the first steps. First, I have to get the data. So I downloaded 4 years worth of data. I selected out all the records for those 6 counties, and I identified all the producing horizontal wells. Not just the good ones, not just the bad ones, all 1,540. And then I went through and determined the initial production level on every one of those. I had to have a consistent comparison across all the wells. So even though there's multi-years in there for a lot of the wells, I only picked the first reporting period where the production level was the highest. And then I computed the initial production values across 81 towns and those 6 counties. So I now have an amazing amount of data. I got to make sense of it all. As a system, I got to be a system architect because I'm good at finding patterns and putting together a very coherent description of a very complex system for hundreds of engineers to do development work too. So I know how to do this kind of stuff. And what I found, I was able to use to project into New York, I think pretty convincingly. And I was absolutely stayed with publicly available data. Anybody that sees what my recipe for how I did this work is and has access to that database can go check me out. Okay, here's the initial production concept that I was mentioning. I'm sure you've all heard about that. It's on the top of this decline curve. It's that very first producing point in the first 30 days. The other curve here is the cumulative production. So this is over a 10-year period. You can see it declines, but I wasn't paying any attention to any of this data down here. I only started and used for comparison that initial production. Since a lot of this is a 6-month reporting period, I mathematically corrected up this curve to the starting point for anything that came online, beyond the 30-day point. And so I presented all the wells in their best light as they would have been when they first came online. So here's the first pattern I started to find. I mapped all of the wells, all 1,540 across the 6 counties, into a performance grid here, 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 7, and 7 plus. And I calculated the percentage of wells in each one of those buckets because for my pattern I needed to do this. And I determined the median, which is the point at which there's an equal number of wells above that point and below that point. It's 4.0 across all of those, 4.0 million cubic feet per day across all those wells. Now here's just an example of the data that I cranked through on those 1,540 wells. There's a sample of 4 towns. So we have Potter, Pleasant. I determined using the thickness and depth maps that Brian mentioned, the thickness and depth of the town. I computed the median IP for all the wells in that town. So in this case, there were 6, 4, 5, and 7. The maximum well count in a town was 94, so I couldn't fit all that on this chart. So I just wanted to show you a sampling of what's in my spreadsheet. And I introduced that color code across all of them. So this took a while to assemble all this. But here you can see the performance is pretty consistent in a narrow band, and then over here it ranges all the way from 0.4 up to 9. And this is pretty representative of all 81 towns. There can be a very wide degree of performance variation within a town in a fairly small geographic area. And that would explain why, some people are getting big wells and some people are getting small wells and less return for the landowner. But anyway, I color-coded all this stuff. So when I first started, this spreadsheet had no color in it. And then I started adding color and I said, something going on here. So that was my major starting point. And then I started looking at, I rolled all this up, like I said, to the town level and the county level. Because if you just stare at all this data down at the well level, it just looks like a big pile of numbers and colors. You really can't see what's going on. That's all right, I'm going to start top down. Because on my architecture charts in my profession, I always started top down. My system level architecture always fit on one chart. So here's one chart, it's thickness, and we're going to see what's going on here. Wyoming came in at 6.8. That's pretty good. If you think about every single well, the median across all the wells is 6.8. That's pretty good. But they only had 52 wells in Wyoming, so not a big sample. But it turned out it was the best performing county. 363 wells in Susquehanna, 6.5. That's really good. In order to get that number, you gotta have a lot of really big wells because of the variation within the town. Moving west, 4.4. We just dropped off 2 points going into Bradford, and they drilled the most wells of the 6 counties, but they didn't get the same productivity. Something going on here. Well, look what's happening. The thickness is dropping from 300 down here. All the wells in Wyoming were at 300 feet. Now we've got a sampling down to 150 in Tioga. Next, we're over into Tioga, PA, 430 wells. They didn't get a great return. They're down at 2.7, 1.6, 1.9. And they didn't do a lot more drilling there. Wonder why. Okay, but that's a good thing. They got smart and they left. All right, so now let's walk down real quickly. What I did here was I kept this axis for the IP the same, 12, because 3 towns in Wyoming, they only drilled in 5 towns there. They're continuing to drill down there, but I stopped my window at 2012. 3 towns are really doing hot, 10 to 12, and that's across all the wells. So some of those wells are in the 20s. But then these 2 guys didn't do so well. Guess what? They're moving southwest or southeast. Something else going on there. But they didn't. They still. This was the best county. Now, Susquehanna drilled a ton more wells. 70% of them are above average or high, and they had 6 towns over here that did really well. But you're seeing that they also had a bunch of towns that didn't do as well. Now, Brooklyn Township had the overall highest town IP of 12, which there was a lot of red in that column. And Springfield Township had the highest single well, IP 31. That landowner is probably a millionaire. Okay, you see the lines are moving down now. A lot more towns in Bradford were drilled, 31, but the high and above average percentage dropped down to 56%. So they're getting a lot more lower performing wells. And interestingly, Troy Township had won the contest for most wells in the town, 94, but look where they are on the curve, pretty far down. So it didn't pay off as well as over here where they drilled fewer wells. Now we're starting to see a split. More poor performing wells are coming in Tioga, which is what drug them down to 2.7. And you see this line's no longer up here, it's way down here. Potter, whoa. Now, we're out in the more relevant geology here to New York. Guess what? And it's just getting worse. Okay, so here we got the reverse of what we had in Wyoming and Susquehanna. 73% of the wells are low-performing wells, as opposed to 79% being high-performing wells. And look where we are in the shale. We're out here in the 50 to 100 foot thick range. Okay, so I just took you through, I just took you through these first steps. It took me a couple months to do all that work, and just a lot of tedious grinding away on numbers and making sure that I had everything correct. I double, triple, and quadruple check my work, so I've been through this a lot, and I can guarantee it's correct given the data that's available from the PADP. So now we're going to take a look at maps and graphs to find more patterns. So far we've only found a color pattern and a high-level county pattern of dropping off as shale gets thinner. And I'm going to use those 4 parameters that Brian just introduced: TOC, thickness, depth, and thermal maturity. Here's a zoom in of the TOC map, and this is the New York PA border here. All I did was draw a line around that border section, and you can see that there's a variation of the TOC in here between 14.5 and 17. The yellow and orange are better. And then I mapped those town IPs onto there. So you can see here's the sweet spot that Brian mentioned that gets all the press. It's actually in the lower zone of the TOC, whereas the lower performing wells are kind of distributed across all the different levels of TOC. So as somebody who's looking for a pattern, I don't know, do you see a pattern there? I don't see any correlation, real strong correlation between performance or productivity and this parameter. So I can't draw any conclusions from this other than it's not as important as the other factors. So now let's take a look at depth. We're starting down here in Wyoming at almost 8,000 feet, and we're going up here to Potter and McKean that are around 4,000 to 5,000 feet. So let's see what the data looks like over that. There's the sweet spot, right there where the deep shale is. The next level of performance, we're coming up, it's in the less deep shale, less deep. And there we go. The poorest performing towns were in the shallower shale. Then I took a look at, I took all 1,540 wells. That was at the town level. Each of those dots represented a town. Now I went back down to the low-level detail, 1,540 wells, and I looked at the percentage of wells in each of those zones, those depth zones. So here we got 7,000 to 8,000 feet. Guess what? There's 59% of the wells are high performers. But as you come across that 7,000 foot line, it drops really fast. Whereas here, as the shale gets shallower than 6,000, you start to see the percentage of low and very low performing wells increasing. So if I just notionally project that out, you see that at between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, you got 80% of the wells are low or very low. But this is just one parameter. So now let's look at the thickness, which I've already kind of given you a little indicator of at the county level. But let's go. The sweet spot, 300 feet thick or thereabouts. Everything's really good. As we come into the shallower shale, or I'm sorry, thinner shale, it starts to drop off. It drops off more. It drops off more, and so forth. Does anybody see a pattern there? As the shale thins, the productivity and performance drops off, as it did as the shale got shallower. So now I got two patterns, no TOC pattern, a clear pattern with depth, and a clear pattern with thickness. And you look at the percentages, it's pretty much the same story, except, what does this tell you? That I don't have to project this, I got hard data here. It looks to me like thickness trumps depth in many cases. But there's no question, when you get between 50 and 100 feet, the majority of them are less than one million cubic feet per day. All right, so now I'm at the point where I've got some results for Northern Tier, and I want to go test and see if I'm missing something. So I went over to PA, and I looked at 1,000 wells in PA, from the southwest where they had all that drilling up into the northwest where there wasn't very much drilling. Let's see why they did that. Well, down here in green, they drilled 275 wells, and this is thin shale down here. So what's going on? In New York, the thin shale was not very good. Down here, it's a lot better. They got some red wells. You can see red wells in Potter and McKean, or even in Toyota for that matter. But there's still a fair number of low-performing wells. So then I said, all right, let me look at a couple more counties. And now I start seeing blue. You know, that's a pretty big drop. And wow, they drilled 573 wells in Washington County, less than 1%. Two of them were red. That's not great. And you can see there's a significant number of low-performing wells there, which really drag their overall county level performance down. Whoops, what happened up here? We're down to 6 wells are producing up there. There were a lot more permits and a lot more drills, but there's no production data on them. They're labeled as shut in, but given what they actually published, I got to question whether there's really anything more than that going on up there. So what's going on here? Couple of conclusions. One, this is their hotspot, and it's green because it's very uneven. In other words, yeah, there's a bunch of good wells, but there's way more poor wells, so it drug it down. I wouldn't call that a hotspot. I would call that a few little hotspots around town. So now let's see what's going on. I mean, that's thin shale down there, but why are they getting all those red wells? Well, guess what? They're down between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, just like the hotspot was up here. But it's not anywhere near as good a hotspot as in Susquehanna, would you say? I mean, that should be red, not green. So that's the situation out there. So now this is just on thickness and depth maps. So I say, all right, what if I combine these two things together? Let's look at it from both dimensions at the same time. So this grid is thickness going this way, so from 50 to 325, and here's 8,000 to 3,000. So now what I did was I took all 1,540 wells, and I had characterized them by thickness and depth, so I was able to calculate the median IP in all of these cells. So I started working on that. I'd take my spreadsheet and move all the columns around into consistent thickness and depth. Well, as you would expect, over there in thick, deep shale, there's 322 wells that were, pretty high performers. And then a little bit drop off beyond that. I'm not sure why here. There was a couple of towns that were blue out there on the east side that drug that number down a little bit. So this is the number of wells, and this is the median IP for that zone. Now, as we move into thinner, shallower shale, what happens? Well, we drop off pretty quick. We drop off some more, and we drop off some more. Now, notice what's going on here. The number of wells is decreasing the performance.